Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is David Sam, and I'm the chairperson for the Lifetime Achievement Award. And this award is the highest award we give to our fellows. And these are people who have made significant contribution to the field in the field of intercultural research and so on. And I'm here this morning to introduce to you the winner of the 2021 award. Actually, there were two people who received the award, Professor Jan-Peter van Oudenhoven and Professor Colleen Ward. But before I introduce Professor Ward, I just want to say something very briefly as to who were the members of this committee. And there were three members of this committee. Well, I say three, but I was the fourth person as the chair. And then there were three people who did the evaluation. And they are all former recipients of the award. So they are highly competent people. And these were Professor John Berry, Professor Marcella, and then Professor Dan Landis. So these were the people who did this evaluation. Originally, I wanted to go through the citation we had written for Professor Ward, but for the purposes of time, I had to improvise it, and I decided to read just the first paragraph. And what I'll say is that Professor Ward is one of the most influential psychologists today, with a career that spans nearly 40 years. Colleen's education, professional career, and research are infused with international perspective. For the past, close to 20 years, she has been a professor and the founding director of the Center for Applied Cross-Cultural Research in Victoria University in Wellington, New Zealand. Colleen is internationally acknowledged as a leading authority on acculturation, immigration, and intercultural research, and her scholarship has been recognized with a range of awards and fellows. I'm not going to spend time to talk about all of these for the purpose of time, but one of which I checked this morning was that her citation, she has more than 35,000 citations. That says quite a lot. And I'm not going to, as I said, take a lot of time. You are here to listen to her presentation and not her achievements, but her achievements also need to be recognized. Professor Colleen Ward, please. This is the award, and congratulations. So the floor is yours.
Okay. I'll go down. Thank you. Thanks for the introduction, David. I would like to thank the Academy, the Awards Committee, and in particular, Nan Sussman, who nominated me for this Lifetime Achievement Award. It's very special to me because IAIR has been a professional, you can see I'm getting emotionally choked up by this. IAIR has been a professional home to me, not only a professional home, but my family. And I hope that those of you who are new to our Academy have felt as welcomed as I have felt for the many years that I have been a member. Now, I've never given a Lifetime Achievement Award talk before, so I didn't really know what to say. And even the title, when I say a lifetime of acculturation theory and research, isn't completely accurate because it was more than a decade after my PhD that I actually fell into acculturation theory and research. But this is what I'd like to do. I'd like to present, before I go there, I did also want to say, I wanted to pay tribute to Jan-Peter van Oudenhoven, the fellow recipient of the Lifetime Achievement Award. I'm so sorry he can't be here with us. We've been professional colleagues and buddies for a long time, so I'm really missing him right now. So, in terms of what I would like to do today, I'd like to talk about acculturation theory and research. I'd like to partly have a stroll down memory lane, partly talk about issues and challenges that we're still confronting in the field, and consider where we might go to next. And in going through history and current challenges and issues, I would like to sort of situate my own research or possible contributions to the field as it has developed. But I'm intertwining that with criticisms, both of our field as well as my own work, and bearing this in mind in terms of how we go forward. So I'd like to talk about theory, measurement, interestingly enough, particularly after following on Steve and Miriam, process and context, which are important issues in this field. Consider contextual approaches, because I'm both an intercultural and cross-cultural psychologist from cross-cultural, cultural, and indigenous perspectives, and ask the question, really, where to next? So, what about theory? Okay, now this is part of the stroll down memory lane. I did kind of fall into acculturation research when I arrived in New Zealand at Christchurch in 1986, after having spent 7 years in Southeast Asia. I'm like, where am I going to get my cultural thrill now? If you'd have known Christchurch in 1986, you could really appreciate what I'm saying right now. But I thought, okay, well, it turned out at the time that Malaysia, where I had been living, was sending more international students to New Zealand than any other country. So I thought, let's do acculturation research with Malaysian students. At the same time, Wendy Searle, a New Zealander who was born in Peru, grew up in Bolivia with her missionary parents, returned to New Zealand as a teenager, and came into my office one day and said, I want to do research with international students. I've come from South America. I have come to New Zealand for the first time as a teenager, and you can imagine my culture shock. And there it all began. So as I began to acquaint myself with the field, I go, this is a bit of a mess, really. This was like in the late 80s. And I'm thinking, okay, there's no real consensus about what the key concepts are, what the theoretical bases are, and particularly what does adaptation mean, or adjustment, because people talked about, feeling accepted, getting along with the locals, or having the skills, or feeling really happy. And yes, all of those things may indicate adaptation, but if you're all over the place and you want to understand what predicts adaptation, I'm thinking we need some kind of a taxonomy. So looking at the literature at the time, I could see two major threads and two very clear distinctions. And I thought, okay, everybody who crosses cultures, and in the early stages, I was very interested, I was interested mostly in sojourners, so cultural novices. Everybody has to deal with their psychological and emotional well-being. That's clearly important. But that's not the only thing that's important when you're crossing cultures. You also need to develop cultural competence. You need to have the skills that are required to thrive in your new environment. And fortunately, there were the theoretical bases of these two streams already, although I don't think they were talking to each other. So in terms of psychological adaptation, originally the research was on migration. It was very clinical mental health oriented. But also in the 80s, or I'm sure I may be corrected if it was earlier than that, John Berry was talking about acculturative stress. And so these more clinical, heavy psychological symptom approaches were being replaced more by stress and coping notions. At the same time, in the Oxford tradition, originating from Michael Argyle, his protege Stephen Buckner, Adrian Furnham, 1986 book Culture Shock, they frame cross-cultural transition in terms of cultural learning, and they were much more concerned with the development of cultural skills. So Steve, in your tradition, I'm giving a little bit of historical background here. And I believe that both of these were important. Now, I just want to say, without going into a lot of elaboration about these two theoretical approaches, but it's important to bear in mind. Stress and coping approach are probably rooted in Lazarus' transactional model of stress, has an orderly approach. And if you apply it to the process of acculturation, you're talking about individuals cross cultures. There are a number of stressors they confront related to crossing cultures. It could be something like discrimination. It could be something like parental pressure for a young person to retain their heritage culture. But stressors are different from stress. And if the stressors aren't managed well, an individual may end up in a state of stress. And if that stress is managed well, you may have negative psychological and emotional outcomes. That core process can be mediated and moderated by a number of factors that we have done lots of research on. I mean our community, things like social support, things like coping strategies, personality. All of these can exert both direct and indirect effects on the outcome. In terms of cultural learning, it's all about learning skills. So when you think about the factors that may facilitate positive outcomes, you think about things like contact with the locals because they're informational sources to you. Personality could also fold in. But point is, these models give you or suggest factors that are going to facilitate positive outcomes. Now, when Kinga did her systematic review of research on expats, international students, and first-generation migrants, 222 studies. And she reported that psychological and sociocultural adaptation were found as outcomes were found in 58 and 63% respectively of all of those studies. So I think that speaks to the usefulness of this distinction. I hope it will remain with us for a while. But moving on from that basic distinction of psychological and sociocultural adaptation, which I hope is theoretically and empirically sound, we then went on to sort of talk about the ABCs of acculturation in the second edition of the Culture Shock book, which I did with Furnham and Buckner. And we talked about affect, behavior, and cognition. Now, the cognitive component, unlike the affect, the psychological adaptation, the behavior, the sociocultural adaptation, I think there were a large number of theoretical frameworks that fell into this category. Not only John Barry's work on the acculturation strategies, modes, and his additional work like on the multiculturalism hypotheses, but we also have things like integrated threat theory, social identity theory. The cognitive dimensions really refer to who am I, how do I see myself, how do I fit with my group, how does my group relate to other groups. So you can look at it purely on a cognitive basis in terms of perceptions and attitudes, but I think if we're honest, we have to say this also has a behavioral component. Now, I guess lucky for me, John Barry and David Sam kind of liked this psychological and sociocultural distinction and added to it. So here we're expanding adaptive outcomes. And in the 2016 Handbook of Acculturation Psychology, Cambridge Handbook of Acculturation Psychology, they expanded John's earlier framework, which look at acculturation both at the group or the cultural level and at the individual level. And so here you can see in terms of adaptive outcomes, references to sociocultural, psychological, and now intercultural adaptation. And essentially, put in simplistic terms, we're talking about doing well, feeling well, and relating well. Then finally, in terms of theory, we're still expanding. And Aggie Szabo and I, in 2019, added to our alphabet of acculturation to incorporate developmental perspectives. So moving beyond the ABCs, I personally think the developmental work on acculturation is amongst the most exciting work that is being done right now, because to a large extent, the developmental perspectives are dynamic. They deal with a lot more longitudinal research, and I think are coming up with interesting findings. Take, for example, Seth Schwartz's work, which is found looking at first-generation Hispanic migrants, that their behaviors change first, then their identities and their values are the most resistant to change. So we're looking at multidimensional conceptualizations of acculturation, and we're looking at them over time. I'm a really big fan of Peter Titzman's work. I don't know if Peter's here, but I know he's on the program. Particularly the developmental work they've done, trying to tease out the difference between normative developmental changes and acculturative changes. So his work has been both longitudinal and comparison with migrants and host nationals or locals. And I'd also like to sort of point out how the people who adopt a developmental perspective are going where we have largely not gone before. And here I'd like to cite Aggie Szabo's work, which you'll hear more about tomorrow, who is looking at aging well in cultural context of migration. So she's working with older migrants, like people my age and older, right? So I think the developmental perspective has really expanded our field in a very, very positive way. Now, moving from theory to measurement, whoa. I think our measurements are often very problematic, including my own, for a number of reasons. As I've suggested already, that when you look at psychological and sociocultural adaptation, there's sound theoretical basis for that, which line up our constructs in an orderly, sensible fashion. But I think there's a question about what we're measuring when we're looking at acculturation and assorted variables in relationship to the outcomes of psychological and sociocultural adaptation. Again, before you can have a measurement, you have to have an agreement about what the concept means. And I think to a large extent, there is a lack of clarity and certainly a lack of precision, conceptual precision, in terms of the factors that we investigate. So what I find, for example, is many people do not appropriately distinguish between stressors and stress when they talk about predicting psychological adaptation. Similarly, others don't really distinguish between stress and the outcomes of stress. So you might say between stress and psychological symptoms. So we have this conceptual ambiguity which results in measurement issues. And one particular one I'll give you because it bothers me to no end, are measures of acculturative stress. Now, what should these scales be measuring? Well, they should, if they say it's acculturative stress, they should be measuring stress, and they should be measuring stress that is induced by acculturation-related phenomena. But there is this confusion between a stress and a stressor. Some people just say, did this happen to you? Blah, 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 agree or disagree. Well, that tells you if they were exposed to a stressor. I have been discriminated against on the basis of my ethnicity. Agree, disagree. If I agree, that's a stressor, that's not stress. But people are calling it stress in the measurements. There are very few scales that I believe truly measure acculturative stress. One I'd like to acknowledge is one by Rodriguez et al., the multidimensional stress inventory. In this scale, there are a sequence of events. The individual is asked, has this happened to you? Has it occurred? If it, or is it appropriate to you? If they say yes, they then rate how stressful it is on a scale from not at all, very. So I think the format for that is psychometrically, conceptually appropriate. There is also the issue, a lot of the acculturative stress scales include items that are generic stresses and may or may not be linked to crossing cultures, like financial pressures, for example, something like that. So I think we need to be a lot more precise in our measurements, which leads me to the original sociocultural adaptation scale, which was not appropriately developed in terms of how one would develop a psychometric instrument, where you start with a large item pool, you whittle it down, you decide how many factors you have, you check the nomological networks. Well, we didn't do all of that originally, but what we did instead was model it on the social situations questionnaire, which was used by Furnham and Bachner. And their scale asked about how much difficulty do you experience, like making friends or relating to members of the opposite sex, or these types of things. So we took some of their items because we did believe that sociocultural adaptation would largely be about social interactions, but we also added in other kinds of items that we thought were really important, like, practicalities of, being able to get around to find the food you want. And over the years, from the original Searle and Ward paper in 1990 until 1999, when Anthony Kennedy and I published a paper on the measurement of sociocultural adaptation. By then, we had 21 different samples, which had responded to scales of varying lengths. There were core items in all of the versions. We were encouraging people, add in items you think that are appropriate to your cultural context if you want to use this measure. And a lot of people did use the measure. And so you can see on this slide the results of a meta-analysis largely conducted by our PhD student, Jesse Wilson, looking specifically at studies that had used the original sociocultural adaptation scale. There were over 10,000 respondents across 66 different studies. And as you can see here, I think every one of the 16 variables, both situational and personality variables analyzed, were significantly related to sociocultural adaptation, but some with large effect sizes and some with very modest ones. Now, this scale had problems. It was limited in a number of ways. First of all, I said it didn't have proper psychometric development. It tapped difficulty when really we were interested in cultural competence, and also it is purely a self-report measure. So, Jesse continued along to do a revised sociocultural adaptation scale, which is 14 items. This was done properly, psychometrically, starting with a large item pool. It was theoretically grounded in Bachner's suggestion that the important adaptation domains regarding skills were interactional, relational, and instrumental, which were about navigating the environment. We developed a bifactor model where you have sociocultural adaptation as the target construct, but there were 3 domains: social interaction, community engagement, and ecological adaptability. And, we did the proper exploration of the nomological network, predictive validity, et cetera, et cetera. Most importantly, now people rate how competent are you at achieving things like building and maintaining relationships. We still have the problem about sociocultural adaptation in that people are telling you how competent they are instead of demonstrating how competent they are. Interestingly enough, back in the 70s, there was the BASIC, which was a measure that was actually behaviorally based. Now, I would love to see that again, but I'm also realistic to know in today's academic environment, when you need to publish fast, get it out, that, behavioral measures where you have to observe individuals being or not being culturally competent are not going to be widely used. But minimally, I think, we could have peer ratings on this scale, or adopt the perspective they use a lot in IO psychology, the 360. So like if you're an expat, you may have your boss and your subordinates fill this scale out describing you. We have got to move beyond just purely self-reports, particularly when we're talking about behaviors. Behaviors. I've been very interested in scale development. These are properly developed scales relating to acculturation in one way or the other, done with students, former students, colleagues. I'm really clear about what these scales are. So an index of sojourner social support, which asks, is it available, and where is it available from, and how available is it? This is available social support. 2 versions of ethnocultural identity conflict scale, one done with Jamie, one done with Aggie, or Aggie did and I joined her. I'm very happy with our multicultural identity size scale, and I'll say a little bit more about that shortly. And with Jamie, normative multiculturalism. And we now also have under review a paper where we've developed a version for educational institutions. When you look at these scales, most of these scales refer to conditions, like do you have identity conflict or not. The multicultural identity style scale, I think, is about process. It's about how people negotiate multicultural identities. And the normative multicultural scales are about context, which of course plays into the argument that Nicholas and I were making in 2016 about altogether acculturation research needs to deal more with process and with context. So I want to say there's life in this old girl yet, so it's not just about strolling down memory lane. I'd like to talk a little bit about some current research that addresses process and context, or current and recent research. You may be familiar with a line of research I'm developing with colleagues on cultural identity styles. This was rooted in work Jamie and I did together with Muslim youth, where we asked them, what does it mean to be successful as a Muslim youth in New Zealand? And they spontaneously talked about balance. We use multi-method research here, but you can see on the slide, I'm not going to read everything to you, but about balancing my life and balancing my cultural affiliations. And then when we asked them, well, how do you do this? How do you be successful? They talked in terms of blending identities, picking and choosing from different cultural affiliations, and also alternating, so switching between cultural identities. Now, these ideas of blending and alternating aren't new. A lot of people have talked about them. Dina Berman, Laframboise, and Jean Finney. But we were the first to say, well, what really is this? Because I was very interested in how we integrate. People tell you integration is good, but nobody tells you how to do it. So we borrowed from developmental psychology the notion of identity styles, which are cognitive and behavioral strategies that individuals use in decision-making about their identities. We took this from Brzezinski, who did work on personal identity, and we said, okay, let's talk about this in terms of cultural identity. And we developed a scale that assessed the hybrid style, which is choosing elements of two or more cultures, putting them together in a unique way, and the alternating style, which is changing cultural identities depending on the situation. And indeed, we did find in our modeling, our cross-sectional survey, that a motivation to integrate predicted both styles, predicted using both the hybrid style and the alternating style, but that the two styles led to different outcomes. So with the hybrid style leading on to cultural identity consolidation, or like a double-barreled cultural identity, and higher levels of well-being. But the alternating style, despite it being prompted by a motivation to integrate, tended to predict greater cultural identity conflict and then lower levels of well-being. So this model, I should say, was also replicated in diverse contexts. We did it originally with Chinese and Greeks in New Zealand, but it was even replicated in Arabs in the state of Israel. So totally different contexts, totally different groups. So it does seem to be a very robust model, but it was only done with cross-sectional data. So now let's get to the more interesting bit, in a way, capturing the dynamic processes with mixed methods. Now, what I'm going to talk about now, or just briefly tell you about now, based on different studies, some of which are not published yet, but if we also go beyond the cross-sectional survey to longitudinal surveys, to a daily diary study, to experimental work, and to qualitative interviews, we can find out more about the processes involved in cultural identity styles. So we know from longitudinal surveys that the motivation to integrate does indeed predict both the hybrid and the alternating style. So we know that works over time. We know also from longitudinal survey that the alternating identity style buffers the negative effects of acculturative stress on well-being over time. So although we tend to be finding that alternating is associated with identity conflict and negative psychological outcomes, it can be functional, or it can be adaptive, by buffering the negative effects of acculturative stress. We know from daily diary studies that while both alternating and hybrid style fluctuate over days, the alternating style fluctuates more, but that fluctuations in the hybrid style is associated with lower levels of well-being. We know from experiments, one successful and one not so successful and one more successful, because we had found in our cross-sectional survey that discrimination predicted more use of the alternating style but didn't impact the hybrid style. So in experimental work with Chinese Americans, we found that exposure to discriminatory messages compared to neutral control messages increased the use of the alternating style in the moment when we related alternating back to those discriminatory messages. And we know from qualitative interviews that it's not as simple as alternating being good and, hybrid being good and producing positive results and alternating less so, that both styles have risks and benefits. So I'll move quickly onto context. And me being me, I would like to look at it cross-culturally, culturally and indigenous. One of my greatest pleasures is being a broker amongst my colleagues. And I could see this study in my head, which brought together Nicholas Gearhart in his, I regard as definitive data set on international students, 2,500 tested 9 points in time before leaving home in the field and after returning home. About 50 countries sending and receiving, and bringing Nicholas together with another colleague that I have been working with, Michelle Gelfand, and her looseness tightness research. And we were interested in, does tightness looseness of the original culture or the destination culture exert any influence on psychological and sociocultural adaptation, and does personality moderate those effects? And this is what we found. Host culture tightness is associated with lower levels of psychological and sociocultural adaptation, but home culture tightness was associated with better outcomes, better adaptive outcomes. Unlike our hypothesis, which expected an interaction effect, that it would be, if you will, easier to go loose to loose or tight to tight, we had no evidence of that. But we did also find that agreeableness and honesty, humility buffered the negative effects of host culture tightness on psychological and sociocultural adaptation. Now, when I'm not enjoying brokering, but I engage in perhaps more simple and long-standing collaborations, this is some work that I've done with Jamie Stewart. And it's about, I think it's culturally oriented because we're looking at how contextual effects of a perceived multicultural environment may impact social and psychological outcomes. In short, we have developed a measure of we call normative multiculturalism, where individuals report on the extent to which they perceive their national environment as being characterized by these three domains. Multicultural ideology, having a general appreciation of diversity. Multicultural policies and practices, having those practices and policies that support and accommodate diversity, and multicultural contact, having diverse groups that are interacting with each other as opposed to leading parallel lives. Many of you would recognize this as the components John Berry proposed as being the key components of multiculturalism. So again, I'm standing on the shoulders of John Berry, and Jamie and I have found over different studies in the UK, US, and New Zealand that these three domains predict largely positive outcomes, largely, often in both majority and minority groups. So greater trust, greater national attachment, greater flourishing, greater belonging. But we did find also that the multicultural policies and practices, if you think your country has more multicultural policies and practices, majority groups feel more threatened by that. Even though the relationship between the policies and threat is attenuated when levels of multicultural ideology and multicultural contact are high. Finally, to spin an indigenous perspective, well, this is just one model we generated in New Zealand with Korean immigrants, where you can see the ideology and the policies exerted direct effects on psychological well-being, but the effects were also mediated by greater sense of belonging. This spinning an indigenous perspective. Okay, this is where I am here and now. This is the hardest thing I have ever tried to do. This is a project where we look at, is multiculturalism helpful or harmful to indigenous people? This is a project where I am the learner, I am not the leader. What we have done is we have assembled a team. I doubt that you'll be able to read the little circles in the upper left-hand corner, but this is how I sort of see the project. At the core are indigenous communities. We are supported by indigenous field workers. We have both indigenous and non-indigenous investigators, which include students. And we have, in New Zealand, we call it kaitiaki, and we will also have a Native American advisory board to ensure that what we do and how we operate is done in a culturally appropriate and safe way. So amongst all of these people, there are two non-Māori, one would be me for the New Zealand-based work, and one non-Māori New Zealand-born PhD student. So this is what we want to do. We are attempting what may be the impossible. We want to blend indigenous knowledge and Western knowledge. So You already have an idea what I mean by multiculturalism from the work Jamie and I have done together, but we don't know what that means to Māori. So we start off with focus groups that we run around the country. We're still collecting these data right now. We subject those to thematic analysis. We take the thematic analysis back to our participants, to our kaitiaki, to our Māori field assistants. We get feedback. We make sure we come to a culturally appropriate and safe interpretation of the data. Knowing then what Māori think multiculturalism is, we will attempt to construct and validate a Māori-centric measure of multicultural norms. And we'll consider to the extent to which it may match onto our Western concept of normative multiculturalism. And then we move to a survey where we look at both perceptions of multicultural norms as predictors of Māori health and well-being. And in terms of measuring well-being, we will use both an indigenous measure that's in development of Māori well-being, which would incorporate spiritual dimensions, as well as the kinds of well-being measures that are used in national health surveys. And if this works in any way or to any extent, the final stage of the project, we will adapt, because we also have Native American collaborators on board now who'll be watching us as all this develops, and extend this to see if we get similar results with Native Americans. And finally, consider practical applications for enhancing well-being. So that's where I end up. I'm glad I didn't add in applications, because I wouldn't have had time to talk about it, although I do think applied work is really important. But I'll leave us with a question. This is my last slide. So like, as you know, I'm an old girl reflecting on decades of doing this kind of research, and I have definitely stood on the shoulders of giants. You can see John Berry's influence permeates a lot of what I have done. And I hope that eventually psychological and sociocultural adaptation will still be with us in another 30 years, but who knows? But what I do think is our younger generation is awesome. And the way they're thinking and the research they're doing with the methodologies and techniques they have, I think it's inevitable that our old paradigms are going to be changed. So will we shift paradigms? And here, I'm just going to read out a quote from Max Planck, known as the Planck Principle. And he says, "A new scientific truth does not triumph by convincing its opponents and making them see the light. Rather, because its opponents eventually die out and a new generation grew up with it and is familiar with it." So I leave you with that thought, and thank you also very much.